All right. I think we can probably start. Welcome once again. Thank you so much for joining us today on day 2 of our power trading webinar. I think probably without wasting time, I would like to hand it over to Mark. Or maybe just before I do that, let me just remind us of our house rules around keep your mic muted, keep your video off unless you're on the floor, and use the chat to engage. And let's do that respectfully, and let's react to each other's commentary on the chat. And keep the sessions cordial. And so let me then take it to Mark for him to just give us some reflections on yesterday before we dive into today's program. Over to you, Mark. Are you ready?
Good morning, everybody. Excuse me. Yes, I am ready. I will just make some quick opening comments, a little bit of reflection. Good morning to everybody, and all protocol observed. And welcome back to our Nersa trading webinar. For those of you that are joining us only today, it's unfortunate you missed the debate yesterday and the inputs from other jurisdictions, but that's fine. Today, we bring the topic home, and we will be covering trading in South Africa, including the broader Southern African context, and with various angles from which one may view the core issues, from that of the network service provider, the system operator, consumers, etc., to look at these core issues that need to be addressed to find future-proof solutions for the South African environment and Southern African environment. The deliberations yesterday were marked by robust debate, and it was important that the sharing of ideas and some difficult questions got asked and some answers were given. However, three central strategic issues stood out for me. One, reform is complex and competing interests exacerbate that. The solutions may look simple, however, the proverbial devil will be in the detail. So we need to garner many and diverse minds to address the challenges and reach consensus on what is best for our part of the world, but at the same time not ignoring the lessons learned and, where appropriate, applying these in our context. But we need to be thinking ahead. Yes, some of the discussions yesterday were not immediately applicable because of the markets, differences in the market, federal systems, etc. But we need to be thinking ahead. The second point was consumer be aware, i.e. read the fine print, because what looks good today may be a disaster tomorrow. And we were given the example of, thinking that buying at wholesale is a good idea. It looks cheaper until the wholesale price rockets. And to adapt Occam's razor, perhaps the simplest solution may well be the best one sometimes. This suggests lots of consumer awareness education and advocacy, and put one of the roles of the regulator and service providers firmly on the table. Awareness is not only the responsibility of the consumer, but is also but especially where information, understanding, and market power are weak, it is the responsibility of the regulator and the service providers. Regulation, the third point, regulation never goes away, but it's always evolving. There are few, if any, jurisdictions where there is not some sort of or some level of state or government oversight to ensure that basic market rules are not transgressed and that abusive behavior is identified, investigated, and rooted out. However, regulation is not an exact science, and imperfections need to be addressed and the learnings used to improve market outcomes. So we look forward to the same level of debate and engagement today, as we requested yesterday, but perhaps didn't emphasize it. Please keep an eye on the chat for the questions and queries that resonate with you, and give them a thumbs up, as that helps us to prioritize questions to ask when there are more questions than time allows. The more thumbs, the more likely the question would get to be asked. We do not all have to agree, but let's at least understand each other so that we can try to build a stable, affordable, and sustainable solution for the future power system. However, therein lies the challenge. For something to be stable and affordable and sustainable, it suggests, depending on one's point of view, an inherent tension that demands robust dialogue and some difficult choices. Let us remind ourselves that the Electricity Regulation Act, that prescribes the regulator's mandate, amongst other things, and demands of us in its opening objectives to ensure that the interests and needs of present and future electricity customers and end users are safeguarded and met, having regard for the governance, efficiency, effectiveness, and the long-term sustainability of the electricity supply industry within the broader context of economic regulation, energy regulation in the Republic. As I mentioned yesterday, we may not get all the answers to our questions, but at least the question will have been asked. And then we can make sure that the answers and solutions are on the agenda moving forward. This Nersa trading webinar is intended to be a dialogue platform. So let's discuss vigorously and respectfully. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for those reflections on our session yesterday. I'm just flighting today's program quickly with the intention to highlight one or two things. Okay, apologies for that. I think something happened with my... Okay. What I wanted to highlight is basically just a run through of what we're going to be handling today. We're going to be starting with an understanding of what the drivers of the rise in trading are within the South African context. We'll move into the impact on the NSP and the discussion around retail trading, the impact in that space. Session 5, we were meant to have a presentation from Ofgem, to just give us a regulatory impact and just discuss with us some of the challenges that they faced in their space, and just some of the externalities that sometimes result in unintended consequences. But unfortunately, they had to pull out due to the elections being announced in the UK. And so once elections are announced, the civil servants are bound by very strict sort of engagement rules. So although our participants tried to get permission, they were unable to do that. They were declined. And so it then meant that we have to think about this session a bit differently and change the format a little bit. So it's unfortunate, but certainly understandable. Just wanted to highlight that. And then so it'll just be a moderated discussion with the traders. And then last session is looking at the regional view, which we expect is going to start becoming quite prominent as we're seeing the industry changing. So with that, I will start to introduce our first session, and I will call upon Mr. Welile Mkhize, who will be moderating the session for us. Mr. Mkhize is the head of department at the Electricity Licensing and Compliance and Dispute Resolution Department within Nersa. He holds a BSc degree as well as a master's degree in electrical engineering. He also holds a master's in business administration, and is currently studying towards his PhD in energy studies. So clearly a fundi. Mr. Mkhize, please take the floor for this session. I will also just be checking if your panelist members have joined. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Vui, for that introduction. Good morning to the members of the energy regulator that have joined. We want to also greet our guests that have joined us from various organizations, as well as any other members of the public online, and our own colleagues from Nersa. So this is the second session, day 2 of the regulatory role in power trading, which is a webinar that we have organized for our benefit, I must say, as well as for the benefit of our stakeholders. I just want to briefly introduce the purpose of this session. The purpose of this session is to look at trading within the South African context, as well as to particularly to look at the drivers that are responsible for the rise in trading in South Africa, as well as, because of course we will be having a presentation from Keith Bowen, who will be talking about the NTC-SA. We also just want to look at the role of the NTC-SA in as far as trading is concerned. In other words, how do traders interact with the NTC-SA? How will they interact with the NTC-SA? As well as, because there are traders that also wish to import and export power from other markets, such as the SEP. How will they be interacting with the NTC-SA as well as other stakeholders? So we just want to have that holistic understanding of trading in the context of the market. So without further ado, we have 30 minutes for this session, for the presentation that Keith Bowen will be presenting, and then a further 15 minutes, or rather 20 minutes for a panel discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to call on Keith Bowen. I just want to introduce Keith Bowen briefly. Keith is working for Eskom. He is the senior manager at Eskom in the NTCSA, the market operator side. Is responsible for developing wholesale pricing mechanisms, supporting internal transfers within the vertically integrated utility, and payments to independent power producers. With the restructuring of Eskom, Keith is involved in developing future market mechanisms and trading arrangements between the transmission subsidiary and other industry participants. Keith holds a master's in economics from the University of Witwatersrand. So Keith, I hope you are on the platform and you are ready. There we go. So Keith, you have the floor. You have about 30 minutes. Thank you so much.
Morning, Wilile. Morning, everyone. Thanks very much for that opportunity to present. I'm just busy sharing my screen. Do please let me know if it's not coming through.
It has come through, Keith. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so this morning I would like to talk a little bit around what is the role of the NTCSA in the trading environment and in the future market, but also to look at the market structures and the intended market platforms arising out of the Energy Regulation Amendment Bill, which we are still waiting for the President's signature. But the bill suggests quite strongly that we're moving into a multi-market model. And what does that mean in terms of the multi-market model? What are these markets that are intended, and looking at the role of the market code and trying to support these different platforms and the market into the future? I think importantly, we need to look at it sort of holistically to identify that the market is already with us. The market doesn't depend on the passing of the ERA. Maybe the platforms would change depending on what that ERA suggests and what the market code suggests. But to a lot of intents and purposes, the market's here already. We are having customers starting to make choice. We are seeing private suppliers being able to compete with one another for customers, and that the market then is, by definition, here, and we're seeing this trade of energy taking place on physical bilaterals or power purchase agreements, and the wheeling arrangements that's already taking place in the market. One of the things that comes with that, though, is that the central dispatch, the system operator, often is unaware of what's intended and what's actually flowing, and we really only pick up after the fact what is the energy that is being transported across the grid. And that has its own problems, and it leads to issues around managing the constraints on the network, managing the network flows, being able to schedule effectively in terms of what energy that we would need to get from the coal power stations, dispatchable generators, to be able to ensure on a day-by-day basis that we're supplying energy across the grid effectively. So there really is an issue where the horse is bolted, the gates are open, and now we have to sort of look at how do we put in the rules to ensure that when that trading takes place, we are also ensuring stability and the support on the grid. The multi-market model itself is not a new concept. Particularly in the South African context, this was work that was done more than 20 years ago. In 2002, 2003, government put together a consortium. They went out to the market and they got consultants, a consortium of consultants from various parts of the world. We had Norway, New Zealand, the US, the UK, a lot of consultants coming in and looking at the South African context and what kind of model would work in this environment. So it really is a hybrid, looking at the elements of the central dispatch mechanism in the United States and the sort of balancing mechanisms and platforms from Europe and settlement processes in New Zealand at the time, looking at how these different things might interact to propose a new model for South Africa. So it wasn't really a cut and paste job from what worked elsewhere and bringing it in, but looking at the local context. That work unfortunately didn't really go anywhere, because then in 2004 government changed its mind in terms of what the priorities, and so the whole multi-market model was kind of shelved and put on the back burner. Now that we have the ERA amendment bill and we're looking at the market structures again and what kind of market rules would be in place, some of that work we've taken and dusted off, and looked at how is it still relevant in the current environment? What happens because of the prevalence of renewable energy, and how does that change these structures? And what is proposed then in terms of multi-market model is very similar. It's not that terribly different from what was proposed then, except for one really important condition or element that we didn't have to deal with beforehand, or actually two. One is capacity, focusing on capacity as a service. How do we build for capacity into the future when the market's operating, which previously wasn't considered a priority, but now it really is, and it's becoming quite an important factor internationally to ensure that there is sufficient capacity on a day-by-day basis on the networks. So that's something that we've had to consider. The second was dealing with the legacy contracts that have been signed. At the time, in 2002, 2003, we hadn't yet rolled out a renewable IPP program or any other programs that have been developed since then. And that means that you have to deal with those legacy items more effectively than what might have been proposed 20 years ago. So, as I said, a lot of this is work that it was around in 2002, but we've kind of tried to update it and look at what are the realities of the current market. In this graph, we're looking at the structure of the National Transmission Company of South Africa and the future transmission system operator. We have four main businesses inside the sort of dotted line of the TSO. There's obviously the network operator, which is the grid. It's the maintenance, the expansion, the refurbishment, the operation of the grid sits within the network operator business within the TSO, and the focus there is obviously looking at the expansion and the maintenance for the existing grid, expanding it to deal with future demand and supply. The system operator, also very similar to the current business of the system operator, but obviously focusing on a much more complex network, a much more complex relationship with various suppliers, various customers involved in the system, and keeping the balance in this future environment. And that's obviously a key business of the TSO into the future. The two new businesses that have been developed within the NTCSA are the market operator and the central purchasing agency. The market operator acts as a platform for others to trade. It is not a buyer and a seller. It does not take ownership of energy. It's purely as almost an indifferent platform provider. It's ensuring that buyers and sellers are able to meet on a dynamic basis. So we have a day-ahead energy platform, a day-ahead reserves platform, an intraday platform, and a balancing mechanism. All four of them related to the physical supply and demand for electricity on the trading day. Obviously, the day ahead, we're focusing on trying to ensure that a day before the trading day or the actual day of delivery, we have an idea of what is expected to be produced or what is expected to be consumed, and we contract on that basis. The day-ahead reserves is where the system operator specifies the reserves that it would require under instantaneous regulating 10-minute, and what other reserve categories might be required into the future, and we ensure that we are procuring that and scheduling for it on a day-ahead basis to make sure that those reserves are available to the system operator in real time. The intraday is really for us to bridge between the positions that are taken on the day ahead and what actually happens in real time, and allowing for generators, traders, consumers to be able to change their positions if things have changed after the commitments on the day ahead. Obviously, there's a trading capability there, a trading need that takes place, and there are costs associated with it. But it's ensuring that by the time we get to the balancing mechanism, hopefully a lot of the generators, the participants, have been able to alter their positions so that the system operator only has to focus on the variations that take place within the hour or in real time. And most of it would have been dealt with under the intraday. If not, then obviously the system operator then, through the balancing mechanism, issues instructions to multiple resources, whether it be generators, demand response, and is able to utilize those resources to keep the system in balance. And then the balancing mechanism after the fact goes and tries to find the allocation for those that cause the imbalance that they now have to pay for what the system operator had to instruct to keep the system in balance. So all of those deal with the physical supply and demand, and that we kind of try and focus that as a central platforms for market participants. Alongside that is the central purchasing agency, which deals with a lot of the legacy items when we've had, for example, the Section 34 IPPs. We have contracts with those existing generators, the existing contracts that have quite some time still to go, 15 to 20 years, some of them as low as 10. But those contracts are not going to be changed with the rollout of the market. The idea is that the Central Purchasing Agency will continue to buy the energy under those contracts, meet the obligations, the prices, the settlements as required under those contracts, but then sell that energy that they've purchased into the market. And the idea here is that the Central Purchasing Agency is almost like a passive market participant, and that they're just providing the information they receive from the IPPs through to the market and taking the financial impact of, one, the price differences between what they have to pay for the PPAs versus what they're going to earn in the market, and secondly, taking on the balance responsibility on behalf of those IPPs. So those IPPs are not taking on balance responsibility. They don't have to go to the market and deal with the imbalances between what was expected to be produced day ahead and what was actually produced in real time. The Central Purchasing Agency has to do that. And it can manage that by either enforcing the forecasting requirements on the IPPs through the PPA, or doing its own forecasting to improve the position and manage the risk of balancing in real time. And that would be one of the key roles for the Central Purchasing Agency. The second role, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, is when we talk about the transition. Moving from our current position into the market, there has to be some sort of transition and a managed transition of going into the full market exposure for existing generators, particularly Eskom generators and other private generators, as well as Eskom distribution and the municipalities and customers that want to be market participants, that we try and manage that transition more effectively. And then the CPA, the Central Purchasing Agency, is the counterparty for what we call the vesting contracts, both upstream with Eskom generators and downstream with distributors, to manage that transition and have a limited exposure for those participants to full market price. The third is the role around capacity. Now, going into the future, obviously the market has a big role to play in terms of determining what capacity gets built, because that's then the impact of competition and ensuring that generators and customers are making the decisions about future capacity. But there's still an expectation that from hour to hour, day to day, second to second, the system operator has a need to ensure that there's sufficient capacity on the grid to meet demand, and to ensure that the right kind of capacity is being built into the future to back up renewable energy or other forms of energy that aren't necessarily going to ensure that demand is met from hour to hour. So the expectation through the Central Purchasing Agency, or even the IPP office, which we expect to continue into the future, is to run indicative integrated resource plans, looking into the future, looking at the risks, and ensuring that if there's a gap between what the market is providing and what people are building for their own needs, that you have identified that gap and potentially go out to the market to procure that capacity. An alternative for that is building a capacity auction or capacity trading mechanism, which looks at 5 years out, 10 years out, and in providing some sort of obligation on retailers, customers, to provide for their own capacity into the future, and therefore trade capacity through some sort of centralized auction. And that gives the signal to consumers or to suppliers to build new capacity to be able to meet these long-term commitments. But that is really the role of capacity becomes quite important, and it's either in the Central Purchasing Agency or we develop those capacity auction platforms alongside as part of the market platforms. When we talk about the multi-market model, though, it's not just about that these different market platforms exist, but that there's the possibility and the likelihood that physical bilaterals will continue alongside the physical trading platforms. And when we talk about the physical bilaterals, we really are talking about PPAs between generators and customers, retailers, and traders who have these long-term contracts, because bankability is still an issue for generators. You want to make sure that going into the future, you can earn revenue and you're able to get the funding for that generation. So the physical bilaterals have a role to play. Over time, with sufficient liquidity and confidence in the market, you may move to doing financial bilaterals, and the financial risks are managed through financial contracting, futures contracting, forward contracting on a financial basis, and the physical flows would be managed through the day-ahead trading platforms. But in the interim, and potentially into the future, buyers and sellers are still able to trade with one another directly and take on physical positions outside the trading platforms. But the important thing there is that those participants, those generators, those customers, retailers, traders, are expected to declare day ahead their physical positions so that we know from a system operator and market operator perspective what is being traded, what is committed, and then those parties then become balance responsible, that they have to ensure that if they deviate from what was declared day ahead in real time, they take accountability for that. And that's quite an important aspect of the market, that you allow for the physical bilaterals and that they are key components of the market, but those physical positions need to be declared day ahead so that the central scheduling process works and that the system operator is able to identify the energy flows accurately and manage that in real time. I think when we look at it from the perspective of the market code, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, as the market operator or the future market operator under the ERA bill as it stands, there's an expectation that the market operator must develop a market code and present it for approval with the regulator. So we've been going through a process to develop such a code. We've put out a draft and we've started engagements with industry to look at how can we improve the code? What is the look of the code that would meet most of the needs for going into the future? And again, it's important that we need to be aware that we can't build the perfect system overnight. You can't build the perfect code. We can build one that works for us and it deals with the interim, but it's something that needs to be amended and improved as we progress. So we've identified in the code various key elements, the roles and responsibilities of the market operator, the system operator, Nersa, market participants, dealing with the processes and how we change the code, how we add new members and participants into the market, how we deal with settlements and credit cover, and then the different types of products. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on day ahead, the reserve market and balancing and how that interacts with one another. And then obviously also then the timelines around financial settlements, queries and disputes, and how all of that needs to be built into the code so that the code then covers those trading rules for all market participants. In the code, we also then talk, as I mentioned before, we talk about the day-ahead energy market, a day-ahead reserve market, intraday and balancing as those key centralized platforms which allow for trading on a dynamic basis and obviously balancing, taking care of the full trade after the fact, even those that are physically doing physical bilaterals. We also then talk about the potential for a capacity market and how that might look into the future. At the moment, the code doesn't really have that. It's still a gap in the code, and that's something that we can be spending this year trying to build up what that should look like into the future. The ancillary services, most of that is covered in the grid code, because the ancillary services are services required by the system operator. The day-ahead reserves we cover under the market code because those are dynamically traded. But a lot of the ancillary services like system restoration, the voltage support and synchronous condenser operation will be longer-term kind of contracting and not something that's scheduled or traded dynamically, and that is covered really under the grid code. The other services, which we don't really deal with that much, but are key to how the market would work, are things like forecasting, the ability to forecast consumption, forecast production for a renewable plant. All of that is quite key services that we'll see into the future, as well as metering and balancing services. On the demand side, we really do focus on how we would build up the supply curve that comes from all the generators bidding their availability, bidding their costs into the market of what it costs them to supply at a particular point, and also the expectation that on the demand side, we would have retailers, customers that are able to forecast what their requirements will be for their consumption, but also provide demand response bids. And that means that they're telling us that if the prices rise beyond a certain level, they are withdrawing their demand. They are consuming less And that then gives us an effective interplay between the supply and the demand curves. And then we set a marginal price. The cost of the marginal generator sets the price for everybody in the market in that hour. So we have a day-ahead price for each hour, and all the people who are scheduled in that process, who are the suppliers, will get paid that price. Those that are consuming will pay that single price for the energy that they've consumed. And there's a whole, theory around the effectiveness of marginal pricing. But in reality, what it means is that you ensure that the generators are incentivized to provide their true cost of operation, so that they are always in a better position, having provided their short-run marginal cost for generation to the system, that they will be dispatched effectively, and they are always at least meeting those supplies, those costs, if not actually achieving a better cost. And similarly, from a demand side, that you are indicating at which point you are uncomfortable with the prices, and that you're ensuring then that you will only consume when you're willing to pay the price that the market is providing at that point in time. When we go on to talking about the intraday and the balancing mechanism, it's important that, as I indicated, the physical bilaterals are declaring their positions. So we have a whole lot of generators on the left side of the graph, and then we have large power users and retailers on the right who are indicating their consumption points for a specific hour. And obviously, after having done the physical bilaterals and the day-ahead market, we've cleared out at a point where supply and demand match, and that we then have a price that applies, at least for those that are in the day-ahead market. But it also, the system operators then knows where these positions are and where the energy is likely to flow from and to across the network. What we then allow, as indicated, we have the intraday market, and the idea, our suggestion, is that it's an auction that clears every 6 hours, so that market participants are able to adjust their positions. They have their positions from the day ahead, and they then can adjust availability or expected consumption on after the fact, or after the day ahead close, and then they're able to adjust those positions. And then every 6 hours, we would clear those positions, and there would be additional suppliers or consumers that are able to reduce consumption based on the price signal, as well as in the other direction, you might have suppliers that reduce their supply and consumers that can pick up consumption based on the price signal, that actually balance out everyone who's adjusted their positions. That then sets a new price, and those that are now adjusted their positions would pay that new price for the energy that they've adjusted. Then we get into the balancing mechanism, and the idea here is that the system operator gets a merit order, one in an upward direction, one in a downward direction, to indicate the additional resources that can be dispatched by the system operator, which could be generation, demand response, and then obviously those that have been scheduled in the day-ahead market can now actually back off on an instruction from the system operator. And we set the prices based on that information, and then apply those prices to those that cause the imbalance, those that are in an up direction and those in a downward direction. There are many choices around the balancing mechanism as to how we can do it. You can always do a netting, so there's only one price in one direction. So either the entire system has moved to the requirement for additional energy, or has moved to the point where there's now energy needs to be backed off, and that you actually require less energy than expected day ahead, and one price is set accordingly. And that's one choice that we can make. We've proposed that it's two prices, so that there's an incentive on generators, consumers, participants, to always provide the best information they can day ahead. And regardless of how their change affected the rest of the system, there's still a incentive, and we're going to call it a penalty, but there's still a payment that deals with the fact that they're out of balance, regardless of which direction it is. What we also try and do under the balancing mechanism is we do a weighted average of the costs to limit the impact of an extreme event. One of the worst things you can do, I think, under the balancing, and this is my thought under the balancing mechanism, is put too extreme a price on generators, on consumers, because of imbalances, and it actually then can lead to dysfunctional behavior. For example, maybe even when generators don't bother to build because they're too worried about the balancing mechanism and what it means and the impact on their ability to forecast long-term advance. You're not then adding the capacity that should be built. Secondly, you can then have generators that actually deliberately undersupply into the day-ahead market or on their physical bilaterals because they're worried about the impact of not being able to meet the expectation, so they'd rather withhold capacity. And then thirdly, potentially even building batteries or other backup mechanisms for themselves to ensure that they can avoid balancing. And all of those can lead to very dysfunctional outcomes. And so it's best that if you want to pool the resources of the country, of the grid, to ensure that the system operator is able to dispatch effectively and has resources available to do so, that the balancing mechanism shouldn't be too punitive. It shouldn't be one that causes participants to panic and therefore either not participate at all or actually do things that are actually then lead to suboptimal outcomes in the market. So designing the balancing mechanisms quite an important aspect in this as well. We've also proposed, if you look at the market code that's on the table, that during the transition, then we actually limit even though we calculate all these balancing up and down prices, we would limit it to the S&P, the day-ahead clearing price, plus or minus a percentage. So, when you have these extreme events, you're kind of socializing the costs to everybody rather than causing only those that cause the imbalance to pay some extreme price. But those are choices that we can make in designing the market code. And so there's no right or wrong, but there's always consequences based on the decisions that we make. I think lastly, just to talk about the future developments. When the market opens, again, a lot depends on when the ERA amendment bill is signed and the timelines that are set between the market participants, the regulator, as to when the market would actually start. But let's just say, hypothetically, it's April 2026. We still expect that there's a transition period from when the market starts to when the market's kind of fully in operation and people are exposed to the market, that we would have these vesting contracts. As I mentioned, the Central Purchasing Agency contracts upstream with the Eskom generators and downstream with the Eskom distribution as well as other distributors as defined currently in the ERA amendment bill, and then manages that gradually during that transition period, the volumes that are hedged between those various players are reduced, so that they're gradually exposed to the market price and therefore can start hedging with one another directly. And I heard Mark was talking about it earlier, that there was a discussion yesterday about how very few people would be, it was not a good idea for everyone to be fully exposed to the wholesale market. So even though we gradually expose the players to the market and the market prices start becoming kind of the fundamental price on which everyone is referencing, there should still be the opportunity for them and the encouragement almost that they would hedge with one another. So the Central Purchasing Agency withdraws from the hedging mechanism, but you expect then that generators and loads, retailers, customers starting to hedge more dynamically, either through over-the-counter trades where they're doing bilateral trades with one another on a financial basis, or through some derivative trading mechanism, whether it be on the JSE or other platform that actually encourages for the people to trade dynamically on future contracts. And that means that during that transition, you're exposing gradually and encouraging people to trade with one another and deal with that. As mentioned, there would be some legacy contracts. So obviously the Section 34 IPPs would continue, and those would continue until they're expiring. There is also the possibility that even amongst the Eskom generation assets, there might be those that are deemed to be stranded, and their contracts might continue. There might be specific decisions made around those into the future as well. But all of that is part of the regulation that comes with the opening of the market to ensure that we've factored in this transition from a wholesale current regulated phase to a full market. And that then pretty much brings me to the end of the discussion. And yeah, if they move on to back to you, Chair.
All right. No, thank you so much, Keith, for that very informative presentation. I think, there's quite a lot to digest, for people that are new to the language of markets. It's quite a lot to digest, and we have limited time to really break down all the issues in granular form. But I think we will try to just probably answer some of the questions. I see the chat is very busy. It's really buzzing with quite a number of questions, and I'll ask that maybe Vuyiswa assist me with some of those questions on the chat. But perhaps before we go there, I'm going to invite some persons on the panel so that we can have a panel discussion. We were supposed to have persons from Treasury, National Treasury, but they could not make this webinar.
Sorry, Chair. They are on the call. Mr. Jeffrey is on the call.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, wonderful. So I'll just introduce Jeffrey from National Treasury, as well as Vuyo Kakazi from Saita. So maybe let me start with Vuyo. They say you should always start with ladies. So Vuyo, just a brief introduction, is a business development and stakeholder lead at the Energy Exchange of South Africa. So she is a trader. She has experience in asset management, servicing some of the largest asset consultants in South Africa and their associated institutional clients. She also has experience in corporate governance, shipping logistics, and brand management. She heads engagements with the regulatory stakeholders in the industry. Prior to joining the firm, Vuyo worked at Investec Asset Management, Barclays Wealth, Old Mutual Group, Maersk, Sealand, and Tiger Brands. So Vuyo holds an MSc degree in finance from the University of London and has completed a certificate in securities from the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment in the UK. She graduated from the Durban University of Technology and further gained a postgraduate diploma in investment analysis and portfolio management. So just want to welcome Vuyo. If you could just get ready to join us on the platform. And then lastly, I'm just going to introduce Jeffrey Uvane from National Treasury. Maybe just as a start, we've had a mouthful with regards to the operations as well as the actual structure or framework of the National Transmission Company of South Africa that has been recently established. But we just want to kind of make the conversation to be as broad as possible so that we can be able to, accommodate all our panel members in this discussion. So I would love that we ask questions with regards to particularly the role of trading in relation to the NTCSA so that we can have as broad a discussion as possible. So perhaps maybe if you could just put on your cameras, the three panel members, so that we could see you and be able to engage with you. Yeah, thank you, Sis Vuyo, and then Mr. Kuvane. All right. Keith, you are also still very much a part of this conversation. And I really like the beard. I'm also trying to grow mine, but it's refusing to become large like yours. But yeah, I'll get some tips afterwards. Yes, so maybe just to start the conversation, there are a number of questions that we have as Nersa, but we also want to involve or include the guests and the persons in this webinar so that we can have a broad conversation. But I think to start, we have questions with regards to probably maybe to start, what are some of the drivers that would cause a rise in trading within the South African electricity industry? maybe also looking at the three phases that you mentioned, Keith. You mentioned that we are currently in the regulated phase, and we will soon move into the transition phase and then finally into the market phase. So what's the current role of phase of trading under this phase, and where do we see the role of trading going in the transition phase as well as in the market phase? And I don't know from the three panelists who would want to maybe take the question, and then we can then maybe see as we go on. Mr. Bowen, probably you'd be most suitable.
Great. Yeah, I'll give it a start, and I think then Jeffrey or Vuyo can jump in. So the idea is, I think one of the biggest drivers we've seen over the last couple of years has been obviously reliability. That load shedding has had a huge role to play in consumers just wanting to be able to have security of supply, but also the European cross-border adjustment mechanism really has had quite an impact, where we're seeing a lot more interest from consumers, particularly large consumers, wanting to be able to ensure that they have almost pure renewable supply, and going out and contracting for that. So I think the role of renewables and the need for renewables has been a big driver, and we're seeing a lot of that. But price is also going to be a thing. If it's not already, it will be very soon, in terms of that consumers want to be able to capture better prices. And so we are seeing competition. And I think that's quite a key learning for Eskom as well, is that competition's already here. We're seeing it, and it's growing basis. And it means that there's a price kind of factor that is playing a role as well. And I think as I identified in the regulatory phase, we are seeing that already. We are seeing that move taking place. Our concern purely from a system management and control perspective is being able to identify that and be able to schedule and dispatch around that energy. And so, the centralized platforms is quite important for us to be able to ensure that we get that information and are able to dispatch accordingly.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Vuyo, I don't know if you want to also come in.
Thank you, Welile. First, I just want to give a bit of background on who SAETA is. It's a South African Electricity Traders Association, which was established in 2023. And the goal of the association is to support, advocate, and promote electricity trading by consolidating the collective interests of all licensed traders in South Africa. The association is currently includes core founding members, which is PowerX, Energy Exchange, and npower. And we look forward to welcoming all newly licensed traders as members. And so if we have any on the call, please reach out to us. You asked the drivers of traders in the South African market. What Keith has mentioned, its continuity of supply and reliability, as well as the supply of green power. Also, its access, opportunity to access this green power. For example, if you look currently, we've seen that companies that have access to this green power or renewable energy are more of your high intensive users, because they do direct bilaterals from the generator to themselves, and they have big balance sheets and able to do that and consume a whole utility scale. And yet you have a tier below that, which is your sort of your medium to small users who don't necessarily have the upfront ongoing capex and investment required to access this power. Typically these high intensive users, the PPAs are long dated, So the customers, the commercial industrial customers that traders, allow to have the choice in this space, looking for sort of short tenor customer PPAs. So those are and also more importantly is the price certainty for customers. So typically prices within traders escalate at CPI versus unpredictability as where we currently are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and interestingly, speaking on price, Keith, I don't know, in terms of pricing, what is your view? Do you believe that traders will become more on demand? Would it primarily be because of price, or would it be possibly because of, as you said earlier, the need for green energy and so on, or is it a combination of factors? Because the reason I ask this is that if traders will be buying from the market and then on selling to their customers, how do we see the price of electricity going generally, under the market scenario? Do we see a kind of like an increase or a drop in prices? Obviously, in the current phase that we are in, we probably won't see much change. But as we continue, and the market becomes deeper, where do you see the price of electricity going, particularly from the market?
Yeah, I think it's dangerous to try and predict where market prices will go. But I think what we can say is definitely I believe there's a combination of the need for renewables and the prices. And as we mentioned, it's kind of also making sure you can lock in the prices, because if you do a long-term PPA, then you can lock in that the price would only escalate by whatever your PPA says the price is, and it's not dependent on other decisions and sort of almost other impacts on the price. But I think importantly, we also have to talk about the structure of the prices. Historically, prices, particularly from an energy perspective, we bundle a lot of products into one price. So when we deal with balancing, we deal with capacity, we deal with the actual short-run costs of producing the energy. All of that generally gets bundled into one energy price that consumers pay. But the reality is, particularly as you start seeing more competition in the market, you have to look at how do you ensure long-term sustainability, and you need to look at the structure of the tariff, particularly at a wholesale level and at a retail level, that you deal with the backup supply, that there is a standby supply that is being supplied currently by Eskom, but in the future, it will be by dispatchable IPPs like gas plant or diesel generators or even batteries, where it's a capacity cost that needs to somehow be separately managed and charged to consumers for that service, because it is a service that is very independent of the energy that is being produced. Similarly, ancillary services, we will see that, and I strongly believe that we will see ancillary services costs escalate quite extensively, because we are going to need more ancillary services, and you need to identify them as separate services provided by various suppliers that need to be recovered, that needs to be recovered. And then balancing itself is a service, whether it's supplied by a retailer, supplied by a generator, or supplied by a trader that has a portfolio that they're managing, balancing across various generators, customers. That's a service. And all of that needs to be separated out of the cost. So when we look at the energy component, I do believe the energy price will decline over time, because competition will drive it in that direction. But the other services also will be competitive, but they need to be separately identified and managed at a wholesale and at a retail level.
Yeah, no, thanks, Keith. And I see that Ms. Kakaza also wants to probably come in on this one. Yeah,
and so I mean, just going, I just want to bring back the conversation to where traders, I mean, are currently, the space we're currently operating in, regulatory space, and where what Keith has presented, where we seeing this space going forward. And I think, firstly, it's important for us to grasp the nature of trading electricity compared to, financial markets and equities and bonds, etc. The difference is that electricity is produced and consumed instantly, right? And at a wholesale level, electricity cannot be stored. So demand and supply must constantly be balanced in real time. So regulatory, how we regulated, how traders are regulated today, just to deliver on the bilaterals that, we working with, is not, is not business friendly, and it's not, it doesn't encourage this competition, nor encourage more power to be injected or invested into the market. For example, as you know, electricity traders are licensed to trade electricity between a specific IPP and a specific customers, as it's shown in the schedules of the trading license. You have a Schedule 2, which contains generators, and you have a Schedule 3, which contains customers. And we have to indicate the volumes of electricity that we are planning to trade, and customer details and agreements, duration, etc. Our concern is that the manner in which, Nersa has licensed these traders. It adds unnecessary red tape and inefficiency to this process. In particular, the requirement that schedules must be updated before trading can take place. This leads to high regulatory burden and delays in the supply of this much needed electricity to the customers. So what we're required to do now, every time a trader brings a customer or a generator to their book, we need to go to Nersa, so Nersa can amend our, amend our license. So
this will, just want to interrupt you a bit, but we had this conversation yesterday, and Nersa acknowledged that we do have a bit of a way to go with regards to improving those types of things in terms of the type of licensing or the licenses that we issue to traders, and what needs to happen with regards to the schedules in terms of generators and customers. So yes, we are very much aware, and hence we have this platform where we are listening, to yourselves as traders, so that we can also improve. But I think I just wanted to assure you of that, and are you still wanting to add to the price conversation? Maybe before I give it to Mr. Kovan.
Sorry to jump in, the organization of which is a big organization for all the traders. I chat box. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, it was mentioned, Mr. Mandela. It's Savia, if I'm not mistaken. Sayita, sorry. It's SAETA, but she can just put on the chat, and then you can be able to access. I saw their website is down currently, but yeah. Can I move on to Mr. Kovan? Mr. Kovan, I particularly wanted to ask you with regards to the National Treasury bailouts. But before I do, I just want to introduce you and talk about your bio quickly so that people can know who you are. Mr. Kovan is a senior manager responsible for the oversight of the energy sector in the National Treasury Asset and Management Division. So he has been involved in all the government bailouts provided to Eskom and was the project leader of the development of the latest Eskom debt relief package. He was also the project leader of the independent assessment that was undertaken by the VGBE consortium on all Eskom's coal power stations. So he's currently the chairperson of the ESCOM Quarterly Monitoring Task Team, comprising of officials from National Treasury and the Department of Public Enterprises. Mr. Kuvane, in Zulu we say we can never finish your accolades. But if you can just come in, Mr. Kuvane, with regards to future plans for bailouts for ESCOM, as well as probably as incentives, in the market to for new participants, do you emphasize that there would be any sort of financial assistance, probably to municipalities who would be future traders as well? They are currently trading, but I'm talking in the sense of, the market. What is your view with regards to future bailouts and the role of Treasury in incentivizing trading in the future? Thank you.
Thanks, Program Director, and good morning, colleagues. So, Chair, just maybe a quick context. The first is we do not envisage providing further bailouts to ESCOM. In our view, this is the last. We don't want to see them coming back anymore from now on. We have changed tech. As you can understand, that the bailout that we've given ESCOM now, it has very strict conditions that they have to comply with. And we envisage that at the end of this term, they should be able to start operating on the strength of their own balance sheet without the fiscus. We are very much keen to see the NTCA operating on a standalone as a credit-worthy entity without the involvement of the fiscus. We are intensely involved in the discussions around the operationalization now, which is envisaged to be closed to be by either July or October, and we are actually monitoring that. We've been quite involved in that process. I think our role, Chair, for now is quite limited. I must indicate that at this stage, it will be difficult for us to then speak about what the future bailouts will be or the future incentives will be. Because normally where we get involved is at the tail end of these processes. We are currently involved in providing government support to all the Section 34 determinations. But there is a slight change of late that we've adopted. That being, after undertaking studies jointly with the IPP office, the minister has decided to reduce the government support that is provided to the renewable energy IPP program. And that relates to only two types of technology, which is the solar PV and the wind. We are providing 80% and we are reducing that further to 60%. And that is in relation to the early termination support that we are providing. Other technologies we are still providing 100% so far. We are coming in at the end when the Section 6670 of the PFMA is then submitted to us for support. How I see this and the presentation that was made by Keith earlier is the CPA contracts are guaranteed. Those are Section 34 determinations that we are currently guaranteeing. And I see us still playing that role of providing that support, albeit with the changes that we are actually implementing in terms of the support that we are providing. And that reducing support for us is as a consequence of us wanting to reduce our contingent liability stock. You would know that there are two items in the budget that we normally report on that are huge in terms of the contingent liability stock. It is ESCOM and it is IPPs. We've started with ESCOM, where we've actually cancelled the guarantee for ESCOM. We are reducing the IPPs. But depending on how the market is structured and how the policy department frame the procurement, as I would indicate that we are neither a policy department nor a shareholder to any of these SOCs in the space. So the policy department and the shareholder will approach us and give us an insight into how the framework is going to work out. And then we'll come on with the support that will be determined at the time. But at this stage, it will be premature for me to speak about the future bailouts that will be provided. But one thing that you can underline is that we are very much not in favor of any bailouts being provided, especially on entities that are listed on Schedule 2 of the PFMA, because those must actually operate on the strength of their own balance sheet. With regards to municipalities, I think it's a different conversation that we would have and see how they actually operate in the space, because you would know we do not provide government guarantees to municipalities. There are incentives that are geared, but we do not actually enter into that space and provide any government support. Let me pause there, Chairperson, and then allow you for any further questions. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Mr. Kuvan. Indeed, I think that the purpose of this NTCSA, or marketizing the industry, was to ensure that National Treasury or the fiscus becomes free of having to prop up Eskom, and I think it's a positive way forward. But we just hope that indeed it will turn out to be that way. I see that Simon Howe has his hand up, so can I give you an opportunity, Mr. Howe, if you can just ask your question?
Thank you. Can you hear me, Mr. Chair?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. Thank you very much, and for a very informative presentation. Fantastic session. I'm very excited to hear this from Nersa and Eskom and the colleagues on the board. Thank you. My question is about, in Keith's presentation, there was a market slide which was very informative, and on the side of that slide, there was an arrow which was essentially looking at the existing bilateral and future bilateral contracts. And I think over the last few days, what we've heard is these bilateral contracts is really where the current traders are playing, and where a lot of the IPPs, like myself, I represent an IPP with 580 megawatts in the private space, and those bilateral contracts are being signed rapidly, far more rapidly than the market itself is being created. And so my question really is, I think Keith did allude to it, what happens with these bilateral contracts in terms of the balancing, and how will that work going forward in the market? Because I think that's quite an important item, which I think, Keith, you did touch on briefly, but maybe if you can just clarify a bit more clearly on what actually happens with these bilaterals over time when it comes to balancing the energy that they are putting to private buyers currently outside the market. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Bowen, you can come in. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, so the idea is that those contracts obviously continue once the market's in place, because they become the physical bilaterals, but that the parties, specifically by default the generator, would become balance responsible, so that the generator is indicating what their expected production is every day and are held accountable according to the balancing mechanism. And I think that's where the role of the traders is quite important, because then the traders can actually do that on behalf of multiple generators, so that you can aggregate the imbalances that occur across multiple generators and be able to offset yourselves, that those that are up can offset those that are down, so your exposure to the balancing mechanism can be limited. But in the space where you aren't able to aggregate, then yes, an individual generator becomes responsible for balancing. The PPAs, from the way I understand how the PPAs are being written now, would obviously then allow for those additional balancing costs to become a pass-through to the customer, because it is a change in law to a large extent, that once the balancing is in place, it's a new mechanism that previously the generators didn't have to deal with. And we've had a lot of discussion with this, as you may know, that we've been doing the market code workshops with industry for a couple of weeks now. And it really is a concern, and I get the concern, that the fact is that you're introducing a new dynamic. But the reality is currently that there is a cost to balancing. Balancing occurs, that when a generator does not generate as they expected at the moment, everybody can just lean on Eskom. But in the future, there's no Eskom to lean on. The system operator has to have resources And those resources could be Eskom generators, they could be dispatchable IPPs, and someone's got to pay for the additional energy. And is it appropriate to socialize that cost amongst all consumers? And that could be the answer, that just consumers keep paying for all these imbalances across the mechanism or the market? Or do you try and accommodate that you ensure that those that cause the imbalance bear some responsibility for the imbalance that they're imposing on the system? And this is a debate that's been held internationally. We are not alone in proposing that there's a balancing mechanism. Europe and North America, a lot of places have balancing mechanisms to deal with that differential between on the day and in real time. And I know the experience I had when we have raised this before. We've been included by some of the developers and some of the customers when they have the discussions around the PPA. What does the future market look like? And every time I've dealt with those and discussed with those, the customers that have existing footprints in Europe, America, other places are completely aware that balancing isn't a requirement. Balancing is an expectation, and that you can't just wish balancing away. And that is the choice we make as South Africa, as we do the rules, whether or not balancing, we want to protect people from balancing, we want to just socialize the cost. But the reality is that there is a cost, and it will be a future issue when you have forecasted information that doesn't actually happen in real time. And the idea is that it should then, to some extent, be that those that have the responsibility to forecast also have the responsibility to do so accurately and carry some cost towards improving their forecasting capability. So yeah, it is definitely an issue for IPPs, and I get it, and that how it impacts your current PPAs. But the fact is right now that you're getting a free lunch because someone else is taking care of that balance capability or responsibility, and in the future that won't be possible. Thanks.
Yeah,
I think that also, just to add on that, I mean, it's the value of traders in the market. So that traders could also play that role of responsible balancing party, which will help. I mean, IPPs is showing concern on this. It helps them focus on generation instead of doing all that and looking for customers. So that's one of the value that traders add into the market, offering all those other services that a IPP doesn't have to. They can just focus on their core business.
Roles, yes, of generating. Yeah, and that was actually the next question that I wanted to ask Sisboy, to say, in your view, what is the overall, responsibility or the value that traders would be adding in the sector? Because someone might look at you as someone who runs a business off your briefcase and say, really, what value are you adding? And I think we want to actually appreciate your role, as you have alluded, that IPPs should focus on generating, and you come in and you play that supporting role. But maybe, because we've got like 2 minutes left, if you can just give us a more comprehensive, appreciation of what role traders are playing now and will continue to play in the future in the South African context. Thank you.
Yeah. So the role of traders and the economic value they deliver to the market is the same as any other financial or commodity market. It forms, it forms a basic economic function, and traders are intermediaries that facilitate the balance of supply and demand. For IPPs, I mean, we will assist in having more generation, in adding more generation into the grid by bringing more IPPs and getting more IPPs to be bankable, right? And also, giving customers a choice to diversify their supplies. And it also, I mean, one of the benefits or the value it adds, it's allow Eskom power to increase its reserve margin, and also maybe Eskom investing more on maintaining the grid and other than spending a lot of spending on generation. So traders, I mean, helps with decentralization of the electricity sector. Rather than putting a reliance and pressure on Eskom being the single buyer. It gives, gives customers more technology supply options and competitive electricity tariffs, helping IPPs to focus on what they do best, and also helping customers to focus on their respective businesses, not having to procure self-generation and spend capex on non-core or a business.
Yeah, I don't know if you. Yeah, are you still continuing? Yeah, because I just had one more question that I wanted to pose to Keith, probably before we end the session. And Keith, that is that in terms of how do you emphasize that the risk of demand and supply will be hedged with regards to, when the new market is in play? Of course, Minister Kubane spoke about the fact that there will not be any more bailouts and so on. So if you can just maybe touch on that quickly, Mr. Bowen.
Right. Yeah. So I think, again, it's one of those things where you can never force people to hedge. So the idea is that during the transition, we will be doing the hedging because it's a transition process. But I think once the market is open, again, I would struggle to say how you would encourage or force people to do it, but you can make it easier for people to hedge. And that's where I think having some sort of derivative trading platform, whether it's operated by the JSE or whomever, to facilitate that buyers and sellers can meet each other and that you can hedge prices going into the future. But the important thing is that these would be financial hedges so that people are exposed to the market price, they're in the market, but they're actually hedging outside the market to manage risk. And I think risk management is quite a key component of any business, and that you would then, as a retailer, you would want to manage that risk as a trader and as a generator. I think it's quite important then also looking at what would be the criteria around which we deal with, let's call them contestable customers or qualifying customers. What customers can be exposed to the market? Is it households? Is it large customers? Are retailers, the distributors, existing municipalities, their customers, can they participate? Those boundaries are still really issues that need to be discussed and finalized. I mean, I know right now the way in which we do wheeling, we kind of almost suggest that any customer other than low voltage can trade, and they can go and do long-term contracts, they can do PPAs. There's quite a lot of freedom in the current mechanism. As we open up the market, do we shut some of that down? Do we allow that those customers still have choice, and that therefore they can make those choices? But if there are customers who can't make the choice, if there's some limit imposed by regulation or whatever the rules of the game are, there would still be retailers who have franchise customers, and they then would have to pass on some costs, and it's a regulated tariff. But how do we set the benchmark for that regulated tariff based on what the wholesale market is doing, what's happening upstream? And that could then also encourage those retailers to hedge because they want to be able to protect themselves and make sure that they are at least doing better than the wholesale market, because they're trying to ensure that they can meet the regulated tariff. So I think it's quite important. I mean, one of the worst things we can do is, as happened in California right in the beginning in 2001, where they actually forbid retailers from being able to hedge. It was a weird kind of dynamic where it kind of then meant that retailers had regulated tariffs to their customers, but were 100% exposed to the market prices, which was an insane way of looking at how you try and drive market behavior. We would probably start with the opposite, where there's 100% protection and then gradually expose, but to encourage people to make it simpler and easier for buyers and sellers to trade with one another on for forward contracting is quite an important aspect. But yeah, being fully exposed, as people have discovered recently in Europe, where for almost a decade, wholesale prices were gradually ratcheting downwards as the introduction of renewables changed that dynamic. suddenly it swung in the other direction, and a lot of people had allowed themselves to be exposed to the wholesale market. I think it's quite important to encourage as much as possible to facilitate that the hedging at the distribution retail space as well as with the generator space to avoid those kind of complexities.
Yeah, no, that sounds reassuring, Mr. Bowen. Yeah, at this point in time, I will give it to the audience to pose any questions. I did see questions earlier on. I think we did allow some questions earlier, but I think we are now wanting just to open it generally to anyone that has a question. If not, I see Mr. Gilling has a question, and I hope I didn't butcher your surname. Mr. Gilling, you can come in, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Willile. That was very well pronounced. Thank you very much. The question is, and really a comment to the audience as well, is I'm interested to hear views on the proposed Eskom restructuring of electricity tariffs in general and WEPs in particular. We've seen in the press that, and seen in past motivations, that Eskom is looking to restructure their tariffs to more fairly, in their minds, reflect the fixed and variable costs of electricity supply. So the restructuring proposals that were previously submitted by Eskom included a reduction in the energy component of the tariff and an increase in the fixed component of the tariff. The result of that is that the wheeling credits that are applied to the wheeling customers' electricity account are purely the variable energy costs. With those going down, it's then the result of that will be that the value of the wheeling credits will be reduced. And I'm interested to see if the participants are factoring this into their future electricity pricing models, because the wheeling credit amounts could be reducing by anything between 15 and 20%, which I would then expect to translate to the amount that the RPPs and traders can charge wheeling customers would reduce by the same. Just some comments on that, please, and maybe to indicate whether I'm understanding the proposals correctly and whether I'm understanding the results of those proposals correctly. Thanks.
Sorry, I can also maybe just take Ms. Moodley, Kamintha, and then maybe both questions can then be answered.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, Keith. Just a question. Yesterday we heard from PJM and MISO, and basically they were saying to us that the risk is carried by all the participants in the market. So if someone fails to deliver, this risk is covered by the participants. Is that how you foresee this future market working as well in South Africa? Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Bowen, I think both questions are for you.
Okay, I'll start with Andrew's question. Hi, Andrew. Yes, so I think yes, you are seeing that there is a direct impact on the credit that is being passed because of the restructuring. And it's not just isolated to this particular restructuring. There was a retail tariff plan proposal that was put forward, which dealt with the start of a change in the tariff structure. It is absolutely true that as we adjust at the wholesale level and then at the retail level, that there would be such an impact that because we're isolating the costs associated with various services, such as the backup supply, the balancing, all those components that right up till now have been bundled into the energy tariff, it would mean that the energy component is reduced relative to the others. As prices are going up and down, we would expect that potentially, even with that adjustment, the energy price hasn't dropped majorly because there are other cost factors driving it. But the point is that what was previously part of the energy tariff, such as the generation standby charge, potentially a future balancing, maybe even some of the ancillary services that have been bundled previously, would be separated out and not that easily bypassable with the credits. So it is absolutely an impact. The reality, though, is that we are seeing that we're introducing different types of technology going into the future, and we need the backup supply. We need additional gas plant. We need additional batteries in the grid, and those need to be factored into the pricing. So it's quite an important aspect to make sure that we try and get that right. We will have movements in either direction over the time, but the restructuring does have the impact that it's not something that is forms part of the wheeling credit. The wheeling credit would still really only be the energy factor as it is currently. Okay, so yeah, and I understand the impact it has on existing wheeling arrangements, but it does mean that we have to factor in that these services are being supplied, whether specifically may even be more supplied with wheeling, but we are just making sure that the customers we're indifferent as to whether a customer chooses from one supplier or the next, because that backup supply is being provided by the grid. I think in terms of the question from Kamintha, I think the idea is that don't forget that different market dynamics apply in different countries. That PJM and MISO, they have balancing, but the balancing it's socialized. That whenever those imbalances take place, that you would socialize the cost amongst all consumers. We're proposing that that's not the case, and we're following more sort of the European kind of model, where we look at balancing being a particular service that's being provided. Certain generators, demand response, are being dispatched by the system operator to offer that balancing. They will get paid for it. We can take that cost and just socialize it to everyone, but that means that those that are causing the imbalance never have to bear the consequence of causing that imbalance, and that can be suboptimal into the future. So the proposal is that you have a balancing charge that covers for those that are causing the imbalance. As I mentioned, balancing, the design of the balancing mechanism, you have to be very careful, because you can overdo it, and in which case you're then causing suboptimal behavior in the other extreme. But the point is that if you provide some signal to those that cause the imbalance, they would then be incentivized to try and improve forecasting, improve their performance, to make sure that they're not leaning on the system from day to day.
All right. No, thank you, Mr. Bowen. Yeah, I see Mark's hand is up. But I just wanted Mark to, for the other panel members, Ms. Vuyo and my other panel member, that, I haven't interacted with you in a while. So I just wanted to get a feel from yourselves with regards to private traders like households, that wish to participate in schemes like net billing and also net metering. What is their role with regards to, to the market, Mr. Puvan, particularly with regards to rooftop solar? Do you anticipate that there will be further incentives from National Treasury to encourage rooftop solar? For consumers to then be able to trade their excess energy, because I think we obviously then need to keep the momentum. You started, I think it was about 2 years ago, where you had that incentive, tax incentive for for those that want to participate, or for those that wanted rooftop solar at the time. Going forward, do you see that there will still be those type of incentives to encourage private trading, rooftop solar in particular? If you can just put on your camera as well. Thanks.
So thanks, Chairperson. So I think what normally happens is we look at the situation as the time progresses. And we've implemented a number of incentives over time, and that were announced during the budget speech of the ministers. But it would be, I think, for me, premature to say in future what incentives and the shape that they will take. But I think as the sector evolves, we may implement certain incentives to encourage a particular behavior, but to actually preempt what that would those incentives would be at this stage, I think for me it would be a bit premature at this stage. I think let's leave it to how the sector evolves and see how that will pan out. But what you can say at this stage is initiatives such as those that are informed by the Section 34 determination are still packages that we are looking at and packages that we are busy working with. I mean, there's still a number of rollouts that are coming through that we are actually adjudicating, and that is still something that we are actually looking at. When the market evolves, and as Keith is alluding to the fact that you might have a situation where you have buyers and sellers trading in the GSA, it might be difficult for us to actually enter that space because we are confined by the PFMA. So, but as things stands with the Section 34 that are actually in line with Section 66 and 70 of the PFMA, that is where our mandate stops. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Kuvan. Maybe just, okay, let me allow Mark to come in. Mr. Bear, you can come in, sir. Thank you.
What's the time? Good morning, everybody. Mine is a simple question, and it's posed to all of the panelists. But if I listen very closely to what Keith has outlined, and again, some of the complexity of it is easily lost because, as was alluded to yesterday, and I think verified by Keith today, moving towards a market and all the related dynamics that flow from that is a complex thing to manage and to codify, as he's alluded to in the market code. But the one thing that seems to pop out all the way, came out yesterday, came out again today, is that all of this is essentially underpinned by a properly unbundled and cost-reflective tariff/pricing mechanism. With that statement, do you agree with that statement or not? And perhaps add any insights that you have. But it seems to me that all of this is fundamentally underpinned by that. And at the more technical level, there seems to also be a critical role for the use of the metering technology to enable one to actually achieve that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mr. Bear. I'll also allow Mr. Lockhart. I hope I'm saying it correctly. Mr. Lockhart, you can come in. Thank you.
It's Mohammed Lockhart from the Energy Council. I'd just like to ask Mr. Truvane, sir, the impact of the carbon tax on the market construct as it will be extended to Eskom from 2026, as far as my understanding, what is that impact? And then secondly, the bailout conditions that preclude Eskom from investing in new plants, what's the impact on that in the new market construct? And a question to both Treasury and Nersa. Eskom has recently said that they'll want to extend the lives of a few coal plants to the cost of about 90 billion rands. Will that sort of expenditure be approved, and what impact will that have on a market construct? Thank you very much.
All right, I think, Keith, you have the first question from Mr. Bear, and then the other question from Mr. Lockhart will be taken by National Treasury, and we'll share the third one. Yeah.
To totally support Mark on that, absolutely. There is an underpinning in terms of a restructured tariff. Now, at a wholesale level, we expect that the market would take care of a large portion of at least the energy tariff, and that energy component is tradable and at the outcome of competitive trading mechanisms. But there are some factors in the tariff which would not be necessarily competitive and therefore need to be regulated. And that would be, at least network charges, because the network operator, whether it be at the transmission level, the distribution level, that those are also regulated correctly. So the use of system charges, including the network, ancillary services, losses, all those components are fully regulated. The we look at specific other items that we've talked about, and if you look at what was in the electricity pricing policy proposed amendments that are still kind of waiting to be signed, it looked at a wholesale tariff structure that also included such things as a generation capacity charge to ensure that the system's able to procure capacity and that the capacity is available to back up the entire system. The potential for legacy charges, which is really the cost of the Section 34 IPPs into the future. As we move into the competitive environment, how do we factor that those costs need to be recovered as we go into the future, and the potential for a subsidy framework as well. So all of that, yes, means that your tariff structure at a wholesale level needs to be able to account for those things and to be restructured accordingly, which facilitates the future market, because it means that the market can function while the other items are being managed through the tariff. So you're absolutely right. And it is complex. There are no easy answers for a lot of this, and a lot of it is choices that we make, and there are going to be unintended consequences, and we have to fix those and deal with them as we work through this process of launching the market and then correcting the market as we develop into the future. But yeah, I do believe you're absolutely correct. The tariff itself, the end customer kind of pricing mechanisms need to reflect a new structure and deal with products and services correctly that previously might have been bundled.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mr. Bowen. And then just Mr. Lacarte's question, I'm not sure if that was answered.
Well, I can try and answer from my perspective. Absolutely, the carbon tax would have an impact because certain producers have to pay for the tax, and that tax they would have to recover through the tariff, through their pricing. And that is the intention of a carbon tax. The carbon tax is meant to try and internalize an externality. And that means that whatever the costs that they're experiencing, which previously were external and now being internalized, have to be passed through into the price. We've had some interesting discussions with various role players around what does that mean for the price? Because if you are then having the price being set, the marginal price being set by a carbon-based generator, that means that there's an increase in price to factor in that carbon tax, and then that all generators are getting the benefit of that increase in price. And there is a there's an impact in terms of social welfare, because now there's a transfer from one set of consumers to generators, and it has an impact, there's no doubt. But that is the nature of the carbon tax, and its job is to internalize those costs, and therefore would have an impact on the price into the future. I can't really speak to the bailout conditions. I think that would be for Jeffrey to deal with. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, Mr. Kuban.
Thanks, Keith, for dealing with the carbon tax. I don't want to deal with it any further. You've done a great job in explaining it. On the conditions, I think the conditions, what we've set out was that we have restricted Eskom from investing in any greenfield project at generation level. However, what we've set in was also a condition to say if Eskom has got any project at generation that they feel that they want to actually invest in, they can approach the Minister of Finance and with a business case and state their business case, and the minister will determine whether Eskom should actually proceed or not. But at this stage, what we have been talking to with Eskom was that we have the Director General has actually allowed Eskom to do the feasibility studies in some of the projects that they actually are looking at prioritizing. So they have been allowed to do those feasibility studies. Once those are completed, then they will come back to the Treasury with their business case, and then we'll actually adjudicate, and the minister will make a determination. But what we are trying to actually, colleagues, to enforce within the 3 years, because the debt relief is only for a 3-year period, is a discipline in Eskom, and ensuring that by the time the debt relief is done, Eskom is able to stand on its own. We do not want to continue standing on behind Eskom, to the extent that our worry was that now we're at the stage where Eskom was close to default, and that was going to actually have a huge impact on the fiscus. That's why we are being strict on Eskom to ensure that Eskom stands on its own 2 feet. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Kobana. I'm not sure
if
yes, Ms. Kakas, I just want to quickly follow up on Mr. Kovan. There was a mention about the coal extension, the life extension of some coal plants to the tune of 90 billion. I'm not sure if that was answered, but in terms of that financing, Mr. Bowen or Mr. Kovan, do we have an answer where that kind of financing will come from? Whether from Eskom, I don't know. Just
if I may comment, this is
yes,
Eskom. This is part of Eskom's corporate plan. It is their plan for the next 3 to 5 years that they've actually indicated that they will have this expenditure to be incurred. We must indicate that within this 3-year window, they are not allowed to go and borrow in the market. So whatever that they're doing, they will have to do it within their current self or generated revenue. So they will have to use their own internal generated revenues to fund whatever projects that they need to do. Going out, they will not be allowed until the debt relief period is actually done. But we have noted it in their strategic plan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe before the session ends, I just have a quick question, Mr. Bowen, or even Ms. Kakaza, I saw your hand up. Can I just maybe come back to you quickly? Ms. Kakaza, do you have anything to add? I don't want to leave you out of the conversation.
Yes, I just want to bring it back again to traders within this market and how for example, in support of what Mark was saying, everything does underpin on unbundling of tariffs. For example, we aren't able to grow and bring much needed power